My name is Morgan Craig, and this is For Art's Sake. The subject matter of this painting is Bethlehem Steel. It's the second largest steel company in America, up until it went bankrupt at the beginning of the 21st century. When I was there, right before the main plant in Bethlehem had shut down, I came upon this scene, and I was taken by how the objects that were scattered about looked or resembled almost pieces in a game, like chess pieces. I thought to myself, in many ways, we are just chess pieces in this game. And in this particular instance, the game is over. And I also found a tie into chess with Bethlehem Steel, because the I-beam, which they used as their symbol, when you look at it and the way that it's positioned in the Bethlehem Steel symbol, arguably it could resemble a chess piece. And thus I titled it Checkmate, as you know, the game is up, it's over. And as is usually the case, the worker has lost, or those that work there, because in many cases, the men that had worked there for years and years and years had nowhere to go. You know, they were guys in their 50s, 60s that had worked in the steel industry for so long that they didn't know what else to do, and no one else was going to hire them. It was devastating for the town, the community, and you know, just shows how this community, these people identified with the architecture, and how they looked at it as almost being a member of their family. This particular painting is of the Packard motor car plant or facility in Detroit, Michigan. Another artist had come in here and done an installation where he had placed televisions on top of some of the pillars. And usually when it comes to graffiti and things that people have done to these environments that I go into, I usually get rid of them in the painting. But in this case, I felt that it tied in so much with the state of our economy and this situation right now with so many people being unemployed. And thus I titled this piece Our National Rerun, to tie into the televisions and the fact that this is cyclical, and that we just keep, you know, the closing down of factories, the outsourcing of work to other countries where it's more or less slave labor, the union busting, it's become an epidemic. I tend to, I thought it would be interesting to bring up the fact of size in relation to my work. I tend to work very large because I feel that many of these spaces have such a monolithic quality, that they demand size, like they need to be on a large canvas. A lot of the color is imagined or heightened. I like to give a luminous quality to these spaces. I want to, in some ways, well, some would say it's giving it a romantic quality or romanticizing the environment. But I think that these spaces, when you enter them, they bring about, or they cause, or they're the impetus for so many memories to come flooding from one's head, that I felt that the color couldn't be stale and stagnant. It needed to be rich and lush and really speak to the viewer. This piece is entitled Palimpsest. This is a school in the lost city of Pripyat, which was the city that was in the direct path of the cloud from the Chernobyl reactor when the meltdown occurred. I titled the piece this because with the word palimpsest, it's referencing the idea of like a surface and how like part of it is worn away and then something goes over top of that and then that is worn away but remnants remain. And it ties into like how history is cyclical, in the sense that, you know, we have a natural element where things initially began. Then we have man coming in and, you know, schooling his or her students, and then we have this disaster that happened with the meltdown that was, you know, so much a part of man's greed and thirst for harnessing power and thus having it go horribly out of control and thus creating devastation, only to then cause abandonment and have nature come back and retake what was once hers. In the case of the lighting in all of my pieces, it's generally imagined. You know, there's, you know, you go into these places and you never know what the weather is going to be like. So oftentimes you can get a dismal, cloudy day. Like, for instance, when I was here in the Chernobyl zone of exclusion, I went during the winter because the snow helps to keep the radioactive dust down, and that is the most harmful thing about going into this zone, is because what happens is when the wind starts to blow the dust around, the dust gets in your lungs, and then that's what causes so many problems. Well, it will kill you. So I went during the winter because the snow would keep the dust down. Needless to say, it was freezing, it was snowing, you know, you had gloves on and boots and what have you, and you were still, you know, it was like you felt the frostbite nipping at your toes. But I feel with the lighting, it has to be dramatic, because these spaces speak of such high drama. I mean, Chernobyl, Pripyat, goes without saying. So I feel compelled to alter that lighting so as to connote or convey that sentiment that I feel. This was a new direction for me because it dealt with a completely different type of ruin. This was a ruin that was caused by a man-made disaster, unlike many of the other spaces or milieus that I deal with, where the factory has either become anachronistic or has lost its purpose. But in many ways, I feel that there are similarities. I feel that despite their differences, you can strangely see similarities, so much so that if I didn't say something to you about where this was located, you probably would see very little difference, or maybe no difference at all. Like Detroit, Pripyat, they look rather similar to one another. I mean, they look, and it was interesting because I was in Detroit, or one of the times that I was in Detroit was was around the same time of year. So I'm up at the top level of the Packard building, and I'm looking out on Detroit, and it's completely snow covered, and on top of that it's snowing, it's freezing, you feel the frostbite nipping at your toes again. You look out and I'm like, this could be Pripyat. This could be, the similarities are just striking. This particular painting is from Cockatoo Island in Sydney Harbor in Australia. Cockatoo Island was once burgeoning with industry. It was actually its own little city of sorts, with all sorts of industry going on. And then in the 90s, there was an economic downturn in Australia, and they shut it down, and it became abandoned. And then the Sydney Harbour Trust took it over. The show is yet to happen, but a photographer, a sculptor, and myself were invited out to Cockatoo Island, and we were given free rein to go in all the buildings and form our own take on the island. And with this particular painting, it's a perfect example of something that I usually don't do. It was some graffiti, and I altered the graffiti slightly. It wasn't quite like this, but I just thought it was very fitting, because so often, especially when we're young, we think that things will just last forever, that we're invincible, that how could this ever end? And thus I titled the piece, Foolish Thing Desire, because it is inherently our desire for things to go on indefinitely. And that is never the case, as we all know. and those that were before us know very well. Well, I feel that these spaces have developed such a humanistic quality that there's no need for people. In many ways, these environments speak so much of death as they do life. They're so lived in. There's such a human quality to these environments that a figure would almost be a distraction to the message that that I'm attempting to convey.
Get the ball rolling to a new career with an Eastern Illinois University degree at Parkland College.
Parkland and Eastern really made it work for me.
For more on Eastern at Parkland, call 217-351-2543.
Catch live play-by-play coverage of Parkland sports. Live the action live. Coversports.net.
I felt like I wanted to be more involved in the school activities at Parkland. And I knew a friend that was in Club Latino. You meet a lot of new people.
We just go to different schools to encourage them to consider college.
This club was actually highly involved in Parkland College, Abre las Puertas a tu Familia. This club did translating, greeting, and taking families on tours. But it's also about having a place to hang out with each other.
This is another painting from Australia, or the subject matter is Australian, but it's, buses and trolley cars are rather ubiquitous, so it ties in with the rest of the world, and also speaks of how the automobile industry decimated purposely the public transportation systems in so many cities, and in the process many newer cities never really developed a proper public transportation system because they relied so heavily on the automobile. And recently, as we all know, the big three, or big two actually, because Ford did not seek assistance from the government to avoid just collapsing. With the high cost of gas and so forth, people sought out alternatives, but for many, the alternatives weren't there. And the thing is it ties into another ongoing theme in my work, and that is that everything ends. That no matter how invincible or how lasting one may think something is, everything comes to an end, such as the automobile industry. They thought that they were unstoppable, that there was no need for trains, trolleys, buses. What was the point of public transportation? You know, it's a waste. But for every line, there is an end. This piece is entitled The Remains of the Day. This is from actually an abandoned power plant. This is where they would feed the coal into the system that would fuel the system. And in some ways I felt that it reminded me a lot of a crematorium, you know, with these giant places where you just, you know, threw this coal in, and then all that remained was ash. So some people will often ask me about, you know, my use of perspective and why it is that it's such an integral part of my work. And for me, it really assists in the impact or the overall impact of the work. I feel the fact that, you know, with linear perspective, it pulls you in. It creates a sense of depth. And I think that these spaces, it's all about depth of meaning. And so therefore, perspective seems a given. Mies van der Rohe said, God is in the details. And I feel that, you know, a lot of these things that I've spoken of, you know, the density, you know, the activity, the amount of what is going on, the complexity of this world, I feel it demands that I put in every little nuance to I guess, raise the voice of the piece. Like the piece, you know, some of the pieces may be quiet, but at the same time, they may scream at you. Like, in some ways, pleading with you to pay attention, to realize what's happening in this world around us. There's a lot of research involved with this work. You know, from going online to looking through books to, you know, because a space has to be more than just some abandoned building. The edifice has to have a history. And that's not so easy to come by. Once you've found these spaces, it's especially difficult to get into them because, you know, the environments are often toxic, not to mention the giant no trespassing signs on many of these structures. So it presents a challenge. Oftentimes it's like get in and get out as quickly as possible. You know, it's basically, you know, I need to get the material that I can then work from. And so I often use photographs and work from the photographs and create the compositions, sometimes from one photograph, sometimes 15 photographs. Sometimes these scenes are exactly as you see them, and other times I've taken objects or pieces from other areas of that space that you may not see within this actual frame, but I felt were important. Whenever I do get a chance, I thoroughly enjoy sketching, but and taking notes about lighting and color and what have you, because as I'm sure you all know, the color of a photograph is not necessarily the color of life. However, recently, as my work has become known and universities and colleges have begun to invite me to have shows and exhibitions and give talks, I've been able to get into spaces such as the one that I spoke of earlier, Cockatoo Island. If I had not been teaching at the Australian National University, I don't think I would have been able to, or I don't think they would have been as amenable to my coming in there and just running amok. Because oftentimes, it just poses an incredible risk for the owner, which I understand. They're concerned about you falling through a hole or you slipping off a ledge, and before you know it, they've got a whopper of a hospital bill. Now, of course, the Ukraine has now decided to open it up to tourism, but originally the Chernobyl zone of exclusion was off limits to everyone except those that could prove that they originally lived within the zone before they were told to leave. I had to come up with a proposal. I had to send the proposal. It was then accepted, and then I had to hire a driver and a guide, and then they took me through the zone. It was interesting because the guide had a Geiger counter, and when we got into certain areas, the counter would start to move to rather high levels, and it was funny because he would say, "We must move swiftly," and because what was happening was we were going through areas that were still high in terms of radiation levels, and you just don't want, the less exposure the better. I also found it fascinating when I was in the zone, how nature had returned to the space. So here you have this man-made disaster and it's just, blocks and blocks of abandoned structures. And then you look down and you see the print of a moose, the print of a wolf. And then in the distance, you see Mongolian horses running across the street. Really was spectacular. And just kind of, without even saying a word, it tied into this whole idea that has been beaten to death, and that is that history is cyclical, and we return, earth covers earth. We return to, it just keeps going around and around.